Every evening around dusk, a set of iron gates on Belfast Cooper Way swings shut, sealing off one street from the next. It has done this every single night for over 25 years, since long after the war that supposedly built it was declared over. The gates are set into runs higher than the Berlin Wall ever did, and there are now more of these walls in Belfast than there were on the day peace was signed. Northern Ireland is 6 of Ireland's 32 counties, partitioned from the rest of the island in 1921 and kept inside the United Kingdom by a Protestant Unionist majority drawn specifically to secure that outcome. For decades afterward, the region's Catholic, largely nationalist minority faced documented discrimination in jobs, public housing, and voting rights, including electoral boundaries in cities like Derry, deliberately drawn to keep nationalist majorities out of local government control. From 1968 to 1998, a period known simply as the Troubles killed roughly 3,600 people and injured more than 30,000 in a conflict fought between the British state, Irish Republican paramilitaries, and Loyalist paramilitaries loyal to the Union. It ended, on paper, with the Good Friday Agreement of April 1998, signed by the British and Irish governments and most of Northern Ireland's political parties, and approved by referendum on both sides of the border. 1912. 500,000 people signed the Ulster Covenant, pledging to resist Irish self-rule by any means necessary. 1921. Partition creates Northern Ireland, engineered with a 2-to-1 Protestant majority. 1968. A civil rights march modeled explicitly on the American movement is baited off a Derry street by police, broadcast on television, and radicalizes a generation. 1968. British troops deploy, at first welcomed by some Catholic residents as protection. 1971. Internment without trial rounds up hundreds of nationalist suspects, almost none of them loyalist, and empties any residual trust in the state overnight. January 1972. British paratroopers shoot dead 14 unarmed civil rights marchers in Derry, a day that becomes known as Bloody Sunday. 1981. 10 Republican prisoners led by Bobby Sands starved themselves to death in the Maze prison demanding political status. Sands is elected to the British Parliament 3 weeks before he dies. 1985. The Anglo-Irish Agreement gives Dublin a formal voice in Northern Ireland's affairs for the first time, and Unionists burn copies of it in the streets. 1994. The IRA and the main Loyalist paramilitaries both declare ceasefires. April 10, 1998. The Good Friday Agreement is signed. 4 months later, a bomb planted by Republicans who rejected that very agreement kills 29 people in the town of Omagh. The single deadliest attack of the entire conflict detonated after the war was declared over. Ask a Unionist why Northern Ireland belongs in the United Kingdom, and the answer isn't naked sectarianism, it's consent. Under the Government of Ireland Act, and reaffirmed in the Good Friday Agreement itself, Northern Ireland's constitutional status can only change with the consent of a majority of its own people, expressed in a poll, not through an armed campaign fought from across the border or from within. Unionists trace their claim to the island back centuries, not decades. Ulster Scots Protestant settlement dates to the 1600s, generations before the state of Northern Ireland ever existed, and the Ulster Covenant of 1912 already shows 500,000 people organizing peacefully against forced inclusion in a Catholic-majority, Dublin-ruled Ireland, a fear that then materialized almost exactly as predicted when the Irish Free State's own Protestant population collapsed by more than half within a decade of partition. For most Unionists, the IRA's campaign was never a liberation struggle. It was terrorism against a legitimate, democratically endorsed state, and the discrimination Catholics faced, however real, was a domestic failure of governance to be fixed by reform, not a justification for a private army. The Good Friday Agreement's core mechanism, no united Ireland without consent, reads to Unionists as vindication. The war didn't change the constitutional answer, only a vote can. Ask a Republican the same question, and the timeline starts earlier and looks different. Partition itself, they argue, was the original violation, a boundary drawn by a foreign parliament in 1921 specifically to manufacture a Unionist majority out of a nationalist island, without ever putting the question to Ireland as a whole. Inside that manufactured state, the discrimination was not incidental. In Derry, a nationalist majority city, electoral wards were gerrymandered so precisely that a Unionist minority controlled the city council for decades. Council housing was allocated to reinforce that map, one family at a time. The 1968 civil rights marchers weren't asking for a united Ireland. They were asking for one man, one vote, and a British government's answer, Republicans point out, was internment and Bloody Sunday, not reform. From that frame, the IRA's campaign reads as a continuation of a century-old anti-colonial struggle, and Bobby Sands' death on hunger strike is remembered not as an act of violence, but of witness, proof, to a nationalist community watching a Westminster government let an elected MP starve, of exactly which side controlled the state's mercy. Sinn Féin's strategy afterward, summarized by its own leaders as the ballot box in one hand and the Armalite in the other, treated votes and guns as two expressions of the same demand. That partition, being illegitimate from the start, be undone, this time by consent, not conquest. Here is what neither government's version of the story quite accounts for. Belfast had roughly 22 of these dividing walls the day the Good Friday Agreement was signed. It has at least 48 today, some taller than the Berlin Wall, running a combined 30 kilometers through a city smaller than most American suburbs. Local housing remains overwhelmingly segregated by religion. Most children in Northern Ireland still attend either a Catholic or a Protestant school, by choice or by default, a full generation after the shooting stopped. And in the 2021 census, something the war itself never quite settled arrived quietly by paperwork. For the first time since partition, people from a Catholic background outnumbered those from a Protestant one. Yet polling since that census has shown that a large share of that same Catholic background population isn't actually voting for a united Ireland when asked, meaning the demographic outcome both sides spent 30 years and 3,600 lives fighting over arrived and didn't resolve the argument at all. The government signed peace in 1998. Nobody signed anything that required the walls to come down, and so, mostly, they haven't. Every episode in this series has asked what happened, who gets to say what it means, and who decides what a gesture is worth. This one adds a narrower question. When a peace agreement is signed by two governments and a room full of party leaders who actually signed on behalf of the wall at the end of your street, Northern Ireland shows a peace that is entirely real at the level of law, treaty, and ballot, and only partly real at the level of which school your children attend and which side of Coupar Way you live on. Maybe the lesson is that a conflict can end on the exact date historians agree it ended, in the exact document they can point to, and still take another generation, one segregated neighborhood at a time, to actually be over. 22 walls became 48. A census answered a question no ballot has yet been asked, and a gate on Coupar Way still closes every night out of a habit nobody's quite ready to break. Next time, we leave an island divided by a wall no one fully controls for a mountainous region two rival countries both call their own, Nagorno-Karabakh, and a war that outlasted the empire that started it.